The engine shut off, and silence pressed against the windows like a physical weight. Kenneth Walker kept his hands on the steering wheel longer than necessary, staring at the eviction notice taped to the dashboard. The paper had gone from white to yellow in the 3 days since the sheriff's deputy had handed it through the car window back when they still had a house to be evicted from. In the back seat, Brandon stared through the glass at the desert spreading endlessly beyond the roadside. His twin brother Ryan gripped the straps of his backpack so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Neither boy spoke. Kenneth appreciated that more than they could know. Words would have required explanations. He didn't have promises he couldn't make. The car ticked as the engine cooled. Outside, heat shimmered off the asphalt in waves that made the horizon dance. Kenneth had driven through worse heat in worse places, carrying worse news. But those missions had ended. This one stretched forward into a future he couldn't map. He turned in his seat to face his sons. Brandon met his eyes. Ryan looked down at his hands. "We're not staying in the car." Kenneth's voice didn't shake, though his hands did. He pressed them flat against his thighs where the boys couldn't see. "I have one more place." The drive took 20 minutes through scrubland that grew sparser with each mile. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels watching them pass. Kenneth had made this drive exactly twice in his adult life, once for his father's funeral 5 years ago, once to scatter Helen's ashes 3 years before that. Both times he'd sworn he wouldn't come back. The desert held too many ghosts. The Quonset hut appeared gradually first as a dark smudge against the pale sand, then as a curved metal structure that had once been painted red, but now wore rust like a second skin. The sign above the entrance still hung by one chain, swinging slightly in the hot wind, "Last Chance Cafe." The letters had faded to the point of illegibility, but Kenneth remembered them from childhood when they'd been bright enough to read from the highway. He pulled the car onto the cracked concrete pad that had once been a parking lot. Weeds pushed through the fissures. Broken glass from the shattered windows caught the late afternoon sun and threw fractured light across the sand. Brandon climbed out first, moving slowly, his head turning to take in the building. Ryan stayed in the car until Kenneth opened his door. "This is really it." Brandon's voice carried disbelief wrapped in carefully controlled disappointment. Kenneth knelt to bring himself eye level with his sons. The concrete radiated heat through his jeans. "Temporary. We'll make it work. We stay together. That's what counts." Ryan finally looked up. "Is it safe?" "I'll make it safe." The padlock on the front door had rusted through years ago. Kenneth shouldered the warped metal frame until it gave way with a screech that sent a lizard skittering across the threshold. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old coffee, and something else. Something metallic that Kenneth couldn't immediately place. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows in solid beams, thick with floating particles. The interior stretched back further than the curved exterior suggested. Tables lay overturned, their surfaces scarred with carved initials and water stains. Chairs had been stacked against the far wall, covered in sand that the wind had pushed through every crack and gap. The counter ran the length of the left side, its formica surface cracked and peeling. Behind it, shelves still held cups and plates thick with grime. Brandon ran his fingers along the counter's edge. "Feels like it's waiting for something." Kenneth raised an eyebrow at that, but said nothing. He'd learned in the field that the first rule of observation was to listen more than you spoke. His son had inherited that instinct without training. They claimed the back corner where the roof showed the least damage. Kenneth spread their sleeping bags on the floor after sweeping away the worst of the debris. The boys unpacked their bags with mechanical efficiency, setting up their small territory in silence. Kenneth watched them work and felt pride cut through his worry. They'd learned to adapt faster than most adults he'd served with. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, Kenneth inspected every beam, every crack in the ceiling, every window frame. His military training made the process automatic. Identify threats, assess structural integrity, establish exit routes. The building was old but solid. The curved metal design had weathered decades better than conventional construction would have. His father had chosen well when he'd bought this place back in 1978. The thought of Ronald brought Kenneth up short. His father had owned this cafe for 23 years before selling it to a corporation that promptly abandoned it. Kenneth had never understood why Ronald kept paying property taxes on land he no longer used. Now standing in the empty building with his homeless sons, he wondered if his father had somehow known they'd need it. Night fell fast in the desert. One moment the sky glowed orange and pink, the next it had gone purple-black and filled with stars brighter than any Kenneth had seen during his deployment overseas. He kept watch while Brandon and Ryan fell asleep on their bags, their breathing evening out into the rhythm of exhaustion. Kenneth sat with his back against the wall, eyes adjusting to the darkness. The building creaked and settled. Outside, something moved through the scrub with a dry rustling that could have been wind or snake or coyote. He didn't reach for his knife. Whatever walked out there posed less danger than the future waiting for them in town. His hand brushed the floor near the counter and stopped. The metal there felt warmer than the surrounding surface. Not hot, just noticeably different. Kenneth pressed his palm flat and felt it a subtle vibration, rhythmic and constant, like machinery running somewhere far below. He sat very still, controlling his breathing the way he'd been trained. The vibration continued unchanged. Kenneth moved his hand 6 inches to the left. Normal temperature, 6 inches to the right. Normal. Back to the original spot. Warm. Something mechanical. Something hidden. Something his father had never mentioned in the brief, uncomfortable conversations they'd managed before Ronald's stroke had ended all conversation permanently. Kenneth pulled his hand away and leaned back against the wall. Tomorrow he'd investigate. Tonight he simply breathed in the quiet and watched his sons sleep, grateful they were together and alive. That was all that mattered for now. The warm spot in the floor could wait. He closed his eyes, but didn't sleep. Old habits died hard, and the desert had taught him long ago that the most dangerous hours came just before dawn. The sound woke him, an engine diesel approaching fast. Kenneth was on his feet before his eyes fully opened, his hand moving instinctively toward a weapon he no longer carried. Sunlight streamed through the eastern windows. He'd slept after all, deeper than intended. The truck stopped outside with a crunch of gravel. Kenneth moved to the broken window and looked out. A Ford F-25, new enough to still have paint, sat 30 feet away. The driver's door opened, and a man climbed down with the careful movements of someone whose joints no longer bent as easily as they once had. Gary Hayes. Kenneth would have recognized his uncle anywhere, even after 30 years of silence. The old man had Ronald's build, the same broad shoulders going soft with age, the same way of holding his head, slightly tilted, as if perpetually skeptical of the world. Brandon and Ryan stirred behind him. Kenneth held up one hand. "Stay quiet. Stay back." They froze. Gary walked toward the cafe entrance with purpose, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. He stopped at the threshold, eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior. When he spotted Kenneth, his expression didn't change. No surprise, no warmth, nothing but cold assessment. "Kenneth, didn't expect to see you here." "Gary!" Kenneth kept his voice level, his body between his uncle and his son's. Gary pulled a folded sheaf of papers from his jacket pocket. "This property belonged to my brother, but his will was never properly filed. I'm filing for ownership transfer." The words landed like physical blows. Kenneth felt Brandon tense behind him, heard Ryan's sharp intake of breath. "Dad left this to me and my sons." Gary's smile held no humor. "Then prove it. You have 30 days before my claim goes through the county recorder's office." He dropped the papers on the nearest table. Dust puffed up and resettled. "Ronald was always too clever for his own good. If he left you something, you'll have to work for it. You're stealing from family. I'm claiming what should have been mine in the first place. Ronald and I built this cafe together. He bought me out. That was his choice." Gary turned toward the door, then paused. 30 days, Kenneth. After that, this land becomes mine by default. You can contest it if you want. Find yourself a lawyer. Good luck with that." The truck's engine roared to life. Dust obscured the vehicle as it swung around and headed back toward the highway. Kenneth stood motionless until the sound faded completely. Only then did he turn to face his sons. Brandon spoke first. "Who was that?" "Your great-uncle, your grandfather's brother." "Why does he want to take this from us?" Kenneth picked up the papers Gary had left. Legal documents dense with text and official stamps. His eyes caught phrases: adverse possession, disputed succession, failure to file within statutory period. "Your grandfather and his brother had a complicated relationship." Ryan's voice came out small. "What does that mean?" "It means we have 30 days to prove this place belongs to us, or we lose it." The boys looked at each other, then at the dusty, broken cafe around them. Kenneth saw the calculation in Brandon's eyes, the fear in Ryan's. They'd already lost their home once this month. The possibility of losing shelter again, even shelter this marginal, hit them visibly. "We'll figure it out." Kenneth kept his voice steady, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. "But we need to be smart, careful. Your grandfather was a methodical man. If he left us something, he left us a way to find it." After Gary's truck disappeared, Kenneth felt the weight of the 30-day deadline settle over everything. He sent the boys to sweep the front room while he returned to the warm spot near the counter. In daylight, it looked no different from the surrounding floor, but when he pressed his palm down, the vibration came through clearly stronger than it had seemed in darkness. Kenneth knelt and put his ear to the metal, a faint humming sound, mechanical and constant. He sat back on his heels, thinking. His military training had included building searches, IED detection, structural analysis. This building had secrets built into its bones. He spent the next 2 hours examining every seam in the floor, every bolt, every weld. The boys kept working without complaint, stacking chairs, sweeping sand, creating pathways through the debris. Kenneth appreciated their focus. They understood without being told that this place represented their last option. Near the counter's end, Kenneth found what he was looking for. A slight gap in the metal sheeting, barely visible, unless you knew what to search for. He retrieved the crowbar from his toolbox in the car and worked the edge carefully. The metal resisted, then gave. Dust poured into the air as the floor panel lifted, revealing darkness beneath. "Dad!" Brandon's voice made Kenneth look up. The boy stood frozen at the edge of the exposed floor, his brother behind him. Both stared at the opening with wide eyes. Kenneth smiled despite himself. "What is it?" "A secret," Kenneth said, "and we're going to discover it together." He let the boys approach, let them see the steel hatch revealed beneath the lifted flooring. Unlike the rusted, deteriorating cafe above the hatch, looked nearly new. Its surface showed no corrosion, no weathering. A small digital panel glowed faintly on one side, numbers blinking in a slow pattern. Brandon knelt beside his father. "What is it?" "Something your grandfather hid." Kenneth studied the digital lock. It required a code 4 digits. He tried the obvious combinations: Ronald's birth year, his death year, Kenneth's birthday. The panel blinked red each time. Wrong. Ryan reached out tentatively, his finger hovering over the panel. When he touched it, the display changed. Instead of numbers, it showed a handprint outline. Green light pulsed around the edges. Kenneth understood immediately. "It's reading us. All three." He placed his hand on the panel first. Green light spread across the surface, then faded to amber. Brandon went next. The amber brightened to yellow. Finally, Ryan added his smaller hand to the space. The yellow shifted to brilliant green, and something deep below clicked with mechanical precision. The hatch unlocked. A rush of cool air escaped from beneath, carrying the scent of concrete and preserved space. Kenneth pulled the heavy lid open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Lights flickered on automatically as the hatch swung back, LED strips illuminating a chamber below. The boys hesitated at the edge. Kenneth didn't blame them. The opening led down into the unknown, into whatever his father had built in secret beneath the desert floor. "I go first. If it's safe, you follow." The ladder was solid steel, cold under Kenneth's hands despite the heat above. He descended slowly, testing each rung. The chamber below came into focus as he dropped into the cool air. Concrete walls, reinforced beams, professional construction that had cost serious money. Shelves lined 3 walls, holding boxes and sealed containers arranged with military precision. In the center of the room, a glass case glowed with soft blue light. Kenneth reached the floor and looked up. Brandon and Ryan's faces appeared at the opening above, silhouetted against the bright desert sky. "It's safe. Come down." They descended one at a time, Brandon moving confidently, Ryan more carefully. When both boys stood beside him, Kenneth felt the moment crystallize into something significant. His father had built this, hidden it, protected it, and designed it to open only for all 3 of them together. The glass case in the room's center drew their attention. Inside, stacked with careful organization, sat bundles of documents, several hard drives, and sealed envelopes. On top of everything lay a single letter, the envelope marked with Kenneth's name in his father's distinctive handwriting. Kenneth's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope. He'd recognize that script anywhere, the precise capitals, the slight forward slant, the way Ronald always crossed his T's with a horizontal line that extended past the vertical stroke. He'd seen it on birthday cards, deployment letters, the single note his father had left at Helen's funeral. He opened the envelope carefully. The paper inside had been folded, once creased with precision. Brandon and Ryan moved closer as Kenneth unfolded it, their shoulders pressing against his arms. The first line hit like a punch. "Son, if you're reading this, the world let you down. I built this for the day you'd need it most. For you and the boys." Kenneth's chest tightened. He kept reading, his voice steady as he spoke the words aloud for his sons. Ronald's letter explained in careful detail how he'd spent 40 years buying desert land when nobody wanted it, watching towns expand slowly toward his properties, selling parcels at the right moments and reinvesting the profits. A network of hidden accounts, secure drives containing decades of financial records, assets stored safely underground, waiting. But the crucial detail came in the second paragraph. "The system requires all three of you. Family verification. I designed it that way deliberately. What I've left isn't just for you, Kenneth. It's for the family you're building. Protect them, trust them, work together." Brandon leaned forward, his finger tracing the words. "He built this for us. Before you were born, before your mother died, before I knew I'd need it." Kenneth folded the letter carefully. He was always thinking ahead. The glass case hummed softly, its blue glow pulsing in a slow rhythm. Kenneth noticed a biometric scanner on the side, similar to the one on the hatch above. He understood the pattern now. His father had created a system that required cooperation, that forced them to act as a unit. Together. He placed his hand on the scanner. Brandon and Ryan followed without being asked. The case's lock disengaged with a quiet click. The glass lid slid back on smooth hydraulics, revealing the contents within. Kenneth reached in and removed the first bundle of documents. Property deeds, financial statements, handwritten notes in Ronald's precise script explaining each investment, each decision, each calculated risk. The boys explored the shelves while Kenneth examined the papers. They moved carefully, touching nothing breakable, their natural curiosity tempered by the significance of the moment. Kenneth watched them from the corner of his eye while he read, proud of their restraint and intelligence. The financial records painted a picture of patient accumulation over decades. Ronald had bought land in 1979 when Arizona desert went for almost nothing. He'd held parcels for years, sometimes decades, selling only when development pushed prices up. The profits had been reinvested in stocks, bonds, more land, compounding, growing, building toward something Kenneth was only beginning to understand. One folder contained nothing but photographs. Kenneth opened it and found images from his childhood, himself at 6, standing in front of the cafe, grinning at the camera. Himself at 16, surly and uncomfortable, the summer before he'd left for the military. Helen young and beautiful the week they'd gotten married. The boys as infants, twins, sleeping side by side in the hospital. His father had documented everything, preserved it, hidden it away in this chamber beneath the desert, waiting for the day Kenneth would need proof that someone had cared enough to prepare for the worst. Brandon pulled a hard drive from one of the shelves. "Can we look at this?" Kenneth had brought the old laptop from the car, thinking they might need it for something. He'd been more right than he'd known. He took the drive from Brandon and examined it. Military-grade encryption, professional setup. His father hadn't been an amateur at this. The laptop sat on one of the concrete shelves. Kenneth connected the drive and waited while it spun up. A menu appeared, folders labeled by year. He clicked on the most recent 2020, the year his father had died. Video files, document scans, audio recordings. Kenneth opened the first video, and his father's face filled the screen, younger than Kenneth remembered, healthier. The timestamp showed March 2022, months before Ronald's fatal stroke. Ronald looked directly at the camera, his expression serious but not grim. Kenneth, if you're watching this, you've found the first chamber. Good. That means you've figured out the lock system. The boys are with you, or it wouldn't have opened. That's important. Remember that. The video continued for 6 minutes, Ronald explaining the basics of what he'd built. Not the full scope that would come later, he promised, but enough to orient someone stepping into this world for the first time. He spoke about patience, about trusting the process, about working as a family unit. When the video ended, Brandon spoke quietly. He recorded all of this for us. He wanted us to understand, not just inherit the money, but learn what it means, the responsibility. Kenneth ejected the drive and set it aside. More folders waited on the shelves, more drives, more secrets. But they had time. 30 days according to Gary's ultimatum. Plenty of time to uncover what Ronald had left them. Ryan sat on the concrete floor, his back against the wall, looking small in the underground space. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Kenneth knelt beside his son. "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because your grandfather made sure of it. And because we're together." He pulled both boys close. "That's all that really matters." They stayed in the chamber for another hour, cataloging what they could see without disturbing too much. Kenneth made mental notes of the organization system, the way Ronald had labeled everything, the careful thought behind each decision. His father had built more than a vault. He'd built a teaching tool, a way to pass on knowledge along with wealth. When they finally climbed back up the ladder, the cafe felt different. No longer abandoned and sad, but purposeful. The broken windows and rusted walls were camouflage, protecting the real treasure beneath. Kenneth closed the hatch carefully and replaced the floor panel. From above, it looked like nothing more than old metal, weathered and forgotten. Perfect. That night, after the boys fell asleep, Kenneth sat with his back against the wall and thought about his father. They'd never been close. Ronald had been distant, often absent, more interested in his projects than his family. Kenneth had resented that for years, had sworn he'd be different with his own children. Now he understood. Ronald hadn't been absent. He'd been preparing, building something that would outlast him, that would protect the family when he couldn't. The distance Kenneth had interpreted as coldness had actually been focused dedication to a goal decades in the making. The irony cut deep. Kenneth had spent 38 years misunderstanding his father. Now, homeless and desperate, he finally saw the man clearly. The recognition came too late for reconciliation, but not too late for gratitude. Kenneth closed his eyes and let exhaustion pull him under. Tomorrow they'd explore more. Tonight, rest. The next morning began with the sound of an approaching vehicle. Kenneth was awake instantly on his feet before the engine cut off. But this car was different. A sedan, not a truck. Professional, not aggressive. A woman climbed out, briefcase in hand, her suit somehow remaining crisp despite the desert heat. She walked toward the cafe with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Kenneth met her at the door. "Kenneth Walker!" Her voice carried authority without hostility. "That's right. I'm Patricia Williams. Your father retained me 22 years ago." She extended her hand. Kenneth shook it, noting the firm grip, the direct eye contact. "I've been waiting for you to show up here." She produced an envelope from her briefcase, thick and sealed with wax. "The real will. Gary doesn't know it exists." Kenneth took the envelope carefully. The wax seal bore his father's initials. "Why didn't you contact me before?" Ronald's instructions were specific. "I was to wait until you came to the cafe, until you found the first chamber." Patricia's eyes moved past Kenneth to where the Brandon and Ryan stood in the shadows. "Until you brought your sons. He wanted you to discover this on your own terms, not because a lawyer told you about it." Kenneth broke the seal and pulled out the document. Legal language filled the pages, but certain phrases jumped out. "Conditional bequest. Family verification required. 7 chambers total. 30-day completion window." His head snapped up. "7 chambers?" Patricia nodded. "You've found one. 6 more are hidden around the property and in the surrounding desert. Your father's will stipulates that you must locate all 7 within 30 days of Gary filing his claim. If you succeed, the inheritance is yours in full. If you fail, it goes to charity. Veterans organizations specifically. Ronald was very clear about that." Patricia pulled out another document. "Gary filed his claim 3 days ago. The clock started then. You have 27 days left." Kenneth looked at the will again, reading more carefully now. The scope of what his father had built became clearer with each paragraph. This wasn't just hidden money. It was a test, a challenge, a way to ensure that only someone willing to work for it, willing to think and persist and cooperate, would inherit. "Why make it this complicated?" Patricia's expression softened slightly. "Because he wanted the process to teach you something. The money's secondary to the lesson." After Patricia left, promising to return if needed, but otherwise staying out of their way, per Ronald's instructions, Kenneth gathered his sons and spread the will's documents across the cafe's least damaged table. Together, they read through the requirements, the conditions, the map that showed 7 locations marked with symbols. Brandon traced the symbols with his finger. "These match the markings in the chamber." Kenneth nodded. His son had sharp eyes, sharper than Kenneth had been at 13. "Your grandfather left us clues. We just have to learn his language." They spent the rest of the day studying the documents Patricia had brought. Each chamber, according to the will, contained not just assets, but also information leading to the next location. A progressive system building on itself, requiring them to solve each puzzle before moving forward. The second chamber's location was encoded in the first chamber's files. Kenneth and the boys returned to the underground room and searched until Brandon found it, a series of coordinates hidden in one of the video file's metadata. Not obvious, but not impossible either. Ronald had calibrated the difficulty perfectly. Following the coordinates led them to the counter's far end to a panel that looked identical to every other panel in the cafe. But when Kenneth examined it closely, he found the keyhole small, disguised as a bolt head placed exactly where the coordinates indicated. One of the drives from the first chamber had contained an image file, just a picture of a key with military insignia etched into the handle. Kenneth had noted it, but not understood its significance. Now he did. He searched the first chamber's shelves again and found the key in a small metal box labeled Tools. The key fit the hidden lock perfectly. When Kenneth turned it, a section of the counter swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing stairs descending into darkness. The second chamber was larger than the first, its walls lined with metal cabinets instead of open shelves. LED strips flickered to life as they descended, revealing a space that felt more like a military installation than a storage room. The air carried the scent of gun oil and old paper. Kenneth opened the first cabinet and found military records, his father's service history documented in exhaustive detail. Photographs of Ronald in uniform younger than Kenneth was now standing with men whose faces had been carefully redacted. Documents marked classified until 2045 in red stamps across every page. Brandon pulled out a folder labeled European Asset Recovery. Inside were financial ledgers, bank statements from Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands transfer records dated from 1989 to 1993, numbers with many zeros. Kenneth read through the documents with growing understanding. His father hadn't just been a soldier. He'd worked in military intelligence, specifically in recovering assets stolen during the Cold War. Money hidden by corrupt officials, weapons dealers, organized crime. Ronald's team had tracked it down and returned it to legitimate governments. Apparently, Ronald had been very good at it, and, apparently, he'd been allowed to keep a finder's fee. Dad, Ryan's voice was small in the metal-lined room. Was Grandpa a spy? Intelligence officer? Different things, but close enough. Is that where the money came from? Kenneth held up one of the transfer documents. $50 million recovered from a numbered account in Zurich returned to the Polish government with a 10% recovery fee retained. Some of it, combined with the land investments compounding over 40 years. He didn't finish the sentence. The boys could do the math. They were looking at generational wealth, the kind of money that changed everything. And Ronald had hidden it beneath a rusted cafe in the Arizona desert, protected by puzzles and locks and conditions that required exactly what Kenneth and his sons were doing, working together, thinking carefully, trusting each other. The second chamber's information led them to the third, hidden beneath the old kitchen area. This chamber was smaller, containing only a single glass case. Inside sat a brass key and another letter. Kenneth opened the letter and read aloud, "Patience isn't waiting. It's understanding that some doors open only when you're ready. This key unlocks nothing yet. Keep searching." Brandon frowned. "That's it? Just a key and a riddle? Lesson, not treasure." Kenneth pocketed the key. "Your grandfather's teaching us to think ahead. Not every chamber will have money. Some have tools we'll need later." They were on day 12 when they found the fourth chamber. The clues had led them into the desert following coordinates to a spot 800 yards from the cafe. Digging through sand and rock, they'd uncovered a metal door set into the ground, sealed and protected from the elements. Inside was a maze, not metaphorical, an actual labyrinth of corridors carved into the rock beneath the desert floor. The passages branched and twisted, some leading to dead ends, others circling back on themselves. Only one path led to the center, where the vault waited. Ryan wanted to force their way through to break down walls or mark their path with paint. Brandon argued for patience, for studying the pattern. Kenneth let them debate, watching how they worked through disagreement toward compromise. Finally, Brandon noticed the symbols carved into the walls at each intersection. The same symbols from the brass key Kenneth had found in Chamber 3. The key didn't open a lock. It was a map. Its shape, when overlaid on the maze's pattern, showed the correct path through the turns. They followed it carefully, Kenneth in front, the boys close behind. The correct route led them through 6 turns, past 3 false doors, to a small vault at the maze's heart. Inside, $500,000 in banded cash and a hard drive labeled Emergency Medical Reserve. Kenneth stared at the money for a long moment. $500,000 in cash. More money than he'd earned in 10 years of military service, just sitting in an underground vault beneath the Arizona desert, waiting. "Can we use it?" Ryan's question was practical, not greedy. "Not yet. Not unless we have no other choice." Kenneth closed the vault. "Your grandfather put this here for emergencies. Real ones, life or death. We're not there yet." But even as he said it, Kenneth felt the weight of the 30-day deadline pressing down. They'd found 4 chambers in 12 days. 3 more remained, and each had proven more complex than the last. The pattern suggested the final chambers would be harder still. They had 18 days left. Kenneth did the math and didn't like the numbers, but they'd come this far together. They'd keep going. That night, sleeping in the cafe, under the stars, visible through the broken roof, Kenneth allowed himself a moment of hope. They were going to make it. The inheritance was real, and they were going to earn it. He just had to keep his son safe long enough to finish what his father had started. Day 14 arrived with heat that felt hostile. Ryan woke complaining of a headache, which Kenneth attributed to dehydration, until the boy tried to stand and immediately sat back down, his face pale beneath the grime and sweat. The fever registered at 101.7 on the thermometer Kenneth kept in the first aid kit. Manageable, probably just heat exhaustion. By noon, the fever had climbed to 103.4. Kenneth held his son's wrist, counting the pulse. Too fast. Ryan's skin burned against his palm, and when he pulled the boy's shirt up to check for a rash, he found it, an angry red line snaking up from Ryan's left forearm where a cut from the metal maze had seemed minor 3 days ago. The wound's edges had gone purple, the surrounding tissue swollen and hot to the touch. Infection, blood poisoning. Kenneth recognized the signs from field medicine training he'd hoped never to use on his own child. Brandon appeared at his shoulder, eyes wide. Kenneth kept his voice calm, his hands steady as he repacked the medical kit. "We're going to the hospital, now." The drive to Yuma Regional Medical took 53 minutes that stretched like hours. Kenneth pushed the car faster than the engine wanted to go, one hand on the wheel, one eye on the rearview mirror, where Brandon held his brother's head in his lap. Ryan drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words that made no sense, his body shaking despite the 100-degree heat outside. Kenneth's mind cataloged possibilities and discarded them just as quickly. The emergency fund in Chamber 4 could cover medical costs, but using it might violate the will's terms. Patricia had said emergencies, but had she meant this kind of emergency? Would accessing the money before completing all 7 chambers void the entire inheritance? Then Ryan's eyes rolled back and his body went rigid, seizing, and Kenneth stopped thinking about money entirely. The emergency room staff moved with practiced efficiency that Kenneth appreciated even through his fear. They took Ryan immediately, Brandon trailing behind until a nurse gently redirected him to the waiting area. Kenneth followed his son through double doors that sealed behind them with the finality of a vault closing. Doctor Laura Bennett was younger than Kenneth expected, maybe 42, with tired eyes that had seen too many emergencies to waste time on false comfort. She examined Ryan's arm, ordered blood work, started an IV of broad-spectrum antibiotics before the lab results even came back. "How long has he been sick?" Kenneth checked his watch. "Fever started maybe 6 hours ago. The cut's 3 days old." Dr. Bennett pressed around the wound, watching Ryan's face for reactions he was too delirious to give. "This is sepsis. The infection's in his bloodstream. We'll need to keep him in ICU for observation minimum 6 to 8 days. The antibiotics we're using are specialized expensive, and we'll need to monitor for organ involvement." The word expensive hung in the air between them. Kenneth's silence must have communicated everything she needed to know. "Do you have insurance?" "No." Dr. Bennett nodded, once her expression unchanging. "The business office will need a deposit. 30,000 by tomorrow morning, or we'll have to transfer him to county." Kenneth looked at his son, unconscious now, small in the hospital bed, with tubes running from both arms. Monitors beeped in rhythms that measured whether Ryan would live or die, based on decisions Kenneth made in the next few hours. "I can pay." The words came out, steady, committed. "I have resources." Dr. Bennett made a note on her tablet. "Good. He's going to need them." Brandon sat in the ICU waiting room, his legs pulled up on the chair arms, wrapped around his knees. Kenneth dropped into the seat beside him and felt the weight of the past 2 weeks settle into his bones like concrete. Is Ryan going to die? The question was direct, honest, deserving the same in return. Kenneth chose his words carefully. "The doctor says the antibiotics should work, but it's serious. We need to stay here until he's stable." "What about the chambers? We only have 18 days left." Kenneth had been doing the same math. 18 days minus 6 to 8 for Ryan's recovery left 10 days at best. 3 chambers remaining, each presumably more complex than the last. The numbers didn't favor them. Ryan's life matters more than any inheritance. Brandon's jaw tightened. He had Ronald's eyes, Kenneth realized, the same ability to see through false comfort to the difficult truth beneath. But if we lose the inheritance, we lose everything anyway. Back to the car, back to nothing. Not nothing. We'd still have each other. The boy's expression said exactly what he thought of that particular platitude. Kenneth couldn't blame him. Hope didn't pay medical bills or put roofs over heads. Kenneth's phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "Heard about Ryan. Emergency clause applies. Page 17, subsection C. Call me." He stepped into the hallway and dialed. Patricia answered on the first ring, her voice crisp despite the late hour. "The will has an emergency medical provision. Your father included it specifically for situations like this. I can use the money from Chamber 4. With full documentation and my authorization as trustee. The 30-day clock pauses during medical emergencies affecting immediate family. But Kenneth, you need to understand, the pause applies only to time. You still need to complete all 7 chambers to inherit. The money you withdraw for medical expenses comes out of your final share if you succeed." Kenneth did the math quickly. 30,000 for the deposit, probably another 60 to 90,000 for the full treatment and hospital stay. 120,000 total, give or take. Against a potential inheritance of 200 million, it was a rounding error. But against the possibility of failure of completing 6 chambers and missing the 7th, it became a gamble with money he might never legally own. "Do it. I'll sign whatever you need." Patricia's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "He was a father first, Kenneth. Ronald would have wanted you to make this choice. I'll have the authorization ready by morning." The hospital admitted Ryan to intensive care just after midnight. Kenneth stayed in the room, sleeping in the chair beside the bed, in short intervals that couldn't properly be called rest. Brandon had wanted to stay too, but Kenneth sent him back to the cafe with strict instructions: don't explore alone, don't take risks, wait. The boy's face had shown everything he hadn't said: the frustration at being sidelined, the fear that time was slipping away, the guilt at thinking about money while his brother fought infection. Kenneth understood all of it. He felt the same contradictions tearing at him with every beep of Ryan's monitors. Morning brought Dr. Bennett on rounds and a slight improvement in Ryan's vital signs. The fever had dropped to 101. The antibiotics were working, but slowly. She confirmed the timeline: minimum 6 days, possibly 8, before Ryan could safely leave. Kenneth signed the financial authorization forms without reading them. Numbers on paper meant nothing compared to his son's labored breathing. His phone rang at 9. Gary's number, which Kenneth had saved from the truck's license plate registration, he'd looked up at the county assessor's office. He stepped into the hallway before answering. "Kenneth Walker," Gary's voice carried satisfaction like a weapon. "Heard about your boy. Shame about the timing." Kenneth said nothing, waiting. "Medical emergencies don't pause legal proceedings. The will's deadline is 30 days from my filing. That was 15 days ago. You've got 15 left. Clock doesn't stop just because life gets complicated." The hallway suddenly felt too small, too warm. Kenneth's free hand curled into a fist. "You're using my son's illness to steal his inheritance." "I'm following the law. Ronald's will doesn't mention medical exceptions. 30 days means 30 days no matter what." Gary paused, and Kenneth could hear the smile in his voice. "Even if your boy makes it, you'll never finish in time. Give up now. Save yourself the heartbreak." The line went dead. Kenneth stood in the fluorescent hallway, breathing carefully, controlling the rage that wanted to consume his better judgment. Gary wasn't just an adversary. He was family blood Ronald's brother. The betrayal cut deeper because of that connection. His phone buzzed again. Brandon texting from the cafe. "I found the entrance to Chamber 5. Symbols match the patterns from the maze." Kenneth typed back, "Don't go in alone. Wait for me." The response came immediately. "How long?" Kenneth looked through the ICU window at Ryan, still unconscious, still fighting. "I don't know." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, okay. But Kenneth knew his son. Knew the Walker stubbornness that ran through all of them. The same determination that had driven Ronald to build an empire beneath the desert and Gary to destroy it out of spite. Brandon wouldn't wait long. Not with the clock running and their future dissolving day by day. The next 5 days blurred together in hospital routines and mounting anxiety. Ryan's fever broke on day 3. He woke on day 4, weak but coherent. Dr. Bennett reduced her estimate to 7 days total, pending continued improvement. Kenneth felt the countdown in his chest like a second heartbeat. Brandon called twice daily with updates from the cafe. He'd found Chamber 5's entrance, behind the old storage shed hidden beneath a false floor panel. The door required 3 handprints, same as the others. He'd tried his own, watched it register as one of 3 needed. The door had stayed locked. "I could probably force it." Kenneth's response never varied. "Don't. We do this together." On day 6, Gary appeared in the ICU waiting room with a lawyer Kenneth didn't recognize. They presented papers documenting the timeline, the deadline, the legal certainty of their claim. Gary's expression held no triumph, only cold determination. 9 days left. Medically impossible. Kenneth took the papers without comment. After they left, he read through the legal arguments Patricia had outlined in her counterfiling. The emergency medical clause was there, clear and unambiguous, but it required Kenneth to invoke it officially, to submit documentation to the probate court, to acknowledge that he couldn't complete the will's terms on time. Doing so would trigger an automatic extension, Patricia explained in her notes. But it would also alert Gary to the existence of the real will, ending the advantage of surprise. Once Gary knew about the 7 chambers, he'd contest everything. The legal battle could take years, and Kenneth had no money for lawyers beyond what Patricia was providing pro bono. The choice crystallized: invoke the medical clause and guarantee a legal fight, or stay silent and gamble on finishing in 9 days with a sick child. Kenneth made his decision on day 7 when Ryan sat up in bed and asked for real food instead of broth. The boy's color had returned, his eyes focused properly. When Dr. Bennett came for evening rounds, she actually smiled. 48 hours of observation, then he can go home. No physical exertion for 2 weeks, but the infection's clearing beautifully. Kenneth called Brandon immediately. "Pack everything. We're coming back." The drive from Yuma to the cafe took an hour. Ryan slept in the back seat, exhausted from just the short walk to the car. Brandon met them at the door, his face tight with urgency. "I didn't go in, but I found something else." He led Kenneth to a spot 30 yards from the cafe where a stone outcropping created natural shade. Scratched into the rock face were symbols matching the brass key from Chamber 3. Brandon had spent the past week mapping every symbol on the property, building a database of patterns and potential meanings. "These point northwest. If you follow the angle," he showed Kenneth the measurements he'd calculated, the trajectory plotted on Ronald's original property map. "There's another chamber out there, maybe chamber 6 or 7. Kenneth studied his son's work with growing appreciation. The boy had done what Kenneth's military training had prepared him to do: observe, document, analyze. Brandon had turned waiting into productive intelligence gathering. "Good work, but first we finish 5. They descended into Chamber 5 together the next morning, all 3 walkers placing their hands on the biometric scanner. The door opened with a hiss of equalized pressure, revealing stairs that dropped deeper than any chamber before. The space at the bottom felt different from the others, smaller, more intimate. A single box sat on a pedestal in the room's center, glowing with the now familiar blue light. But the walls held something new: photographs, hundreds of them covering every surface in a sprawling collage of Walker family history. Ronald as a young man, barely 20, in military dress uniform. Ronald and a woman Kenneth didn't recognize, both laughing at some shared joke lost to time. Ronald holding an infant. Kenneth, his expression uncertain but tender. Kenneth and Helen on their wedding day. The twins as newborns, as toddlers, as gap-toothed 6-year-olds, grinning at the camera. Someone had curated their lives, preserved the moments that mattered, and hidden them in a vault beneath the desert. Brandon moved along the walls, his fingers hovering over images without quite touching. "Dad, is this Mom?" Kenneth joined him. The photograph showed Helen at maybe 19 before they'd met, standing in front of a college building with the confidence of someone who thought she had forever. She'd been dead 5 years now. Cancer, fast and merciless. Kenneth had thought he'd cried out all his grief for her. Apparently not. Ryan found the television monitor first mounted on the wall opposite the pedestal. As they approached it, flickered to life automatically. Ronald's face appeared on screen, older than in the photographs, maybe 65. The timestamp showed this recording had been made just 8 months before his death. Ronald's voice filled the chamber, amplified by hidden speakers. "If you're watching this alone, something went wrong. This chamber requires 3. Courage without your family isn't courage, it's recklessness. Go back. Wait for them." Brandon's shoulders tensed. Kenneth understood immediately his son had been here before, had come down alone despite instructions to wait, had seen this message and made the choice to leave, to trust Kenneth's judgment over his own impatience. Kenneth put his hand on Brandon's shoulder, squeezed once. The boy relaxed, slightly accepting forgiveness for a transgression Kenneth hadn't known about until this moment. The video continued. "Brandon, if that's you watching alone, you've got your grandfather's stubbornness. It's a gift and a curse. Channel it wisely." Ronald smiled, and for just a moment, Kenneth saw his father as he must have been before age and illness hardened him. "Ryan, if you're the brave one who came down first, remember that courage needs direction. Don't waste it on empty gestures." Ryan, still pale from his hospital stay, wiped his eyes quickly. "Kenneth, you're thinking about the deadline, about money and time and whether you can finish. Stop. The inheritance isn't the point. The lesson is. Work together, trust each other. That's what survives when everything else burns." The screen went dark. In the silence that followed, Kenneth heard his son's breathing, heard his own heartbeat, felt the weight of everything his father had built pressing down like atmosphere. The pedestal held 2 envelopes, just as the outline had promised. One marked for Kenneth and grandsons, one marked for Gary's second chances. Kenneth opened the first envelope, his hands steadier now than they'd been in Chamber 1. The letter inside was shorter than Ronald's previous messages, but the weight of it seemed greater. "You've made it this far together, 5 chambers completed, 2 remain, but before you continue, you need to understand something about family and forgiveness. Your Uncle Gary made mistakes that cost him everything I could give him, but mistakes don't erase blood. What I've left for him is contingent on you, Kenneth, on your judgment, on whether you believe he's earned redemption." The second envelope felt heavier, though it contained only paper. Kenneth turned it over in his hands without opening it. His father had put the choice in his hands: extend forgiveness to Gary, or let him face the consequences of 30 years of estrangement. Brandon broke the silence first. What did Uncle Gary do? Kenneth had been avoiding that conversation, but his sons deserved the truth. "Your grandfather and his brother built this cafe together in 1978. Gary handled the money. He was good at it until he started gambling, lost $80,000 of their savings. Your grandfather paid the debts, bought Gary out, and cut contact. That was 1986. They never spoke again." 40 years. Ryan's voice was soft processing. "That's longer than you've been alive, Dad." Family grudges compound like interest. They grow until they're bigger than the original injury. Brandon picked up the envelope marked for Gary. Are you going to give this to him? Kenneth thought about his uncle's cold voice on the phone, using Ryan's illness as leverage. Thought about Gary showing up at the hospital with a lawyer instead of flowers. Thought about 30 years of silence that had poisoned Ronald's final decades with bitterness and isolation. I need more information first. They left Chamber 5 sealed and drove into town. Margaret Campbell lived in a ranch house 6 miles from the cafe at the end of a dirt road that disappeared into creosote and mesquite. Kenneth had met her briefly at his father's funeral, a silver-haired woman who'd cried harder than family. She answered the door with recognition immediate in her eyes. Kenneth Walker, knew you'd come eventually. Her living room was cool and dim ceiling fan stirring the air in lazy circles. Photographs covered the mantel, Margaret younger, with a man who must have been her late husband. Margaret and Ronald, both in their 60s, standing in front of the cafe before it closed. You and Dad were close. Margaret settled into her chair with the careful movements of arthritic joints. He drove out here every month for 20 years, even after selling the cafe. Said he was maintaining something important. She fixed Kenneth with eyes that missed nothing. I figured eventually someone would come asking what he was maintaining. Did he mention the chambers? Never specifically. But Ronald wasn't subtle. All that digging, all those supply deliveries. Man doesn't hide an empire without leaving evidence. She poured iced tea from a pitcher, her hands steady despite their age. What I know about is Gary. Kenneth leaned forward. This was why he'd come. Gary Hayes came to see me last month. First time I'd seen him in 20 years. Asked if Ronald ever mentioned forgiveness. The word landed heavy in the quiet room. Outside, a wind chime rang discordantly. Did he? Margaret stood and retrieved a wooden box from her desk drawer. Inside lay a single envelope yellowed with age but sealed. Ronald wrote this 6 months before his stroke. Made me promise to keep it safe, to give it to Gary only if he asked, only if he proved he'd changed. She handed the envelope to Kenneth. Gary asked. I didn't give it to him. Told him he had to earn it through you. The envelope bore Gary's name in Ronald's handwriting, that same precise script Kenneth had seen in every chamber. The seal was intact, unbroken, across 40 years. Why didn't you give it to him? Because Ronald made you the executor of his forgiveness. That's what all those chambers are about, Kenneth. Not money, judgment. Whether you have the wisdom to know when a man's changed and when he's just desperate. Kenneth held the envelope carefully, feeling the weight of decision it represented. How do I know if he's changed? Margaret smiled, and it carried sadness like a second layer beneath the expression. That's the test your father set. You figure it out. You've earned the inheritance. You get it wrong. She shrugged. Gary's been sober from gambling 18 years. Runs addiction counseling out of his church, all volunteer. Lost his wife to his demons back in the 90s, but he's tried to make amends where he could. Whether that's enough, whether it's real or performance, that's for you to decide. The drive back to the cafe was quiet. Brandon sat in the passenger seat, the unopened letter to Gary balanced on his lap. Ryan dozed in the back, still recovering. Kenneth drove and thought about fathers and brothers and the grudges that outlived the people who held them. Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed everything? The question came unbidden, something Ronald might have asked if he'd lived long enough to explain himself. Kenneth had discovered many things in the past 3 weeks: his father's secret empire, his grandfather's military intelligence work, the capacity of metal and concrete to preserve both treasure and pain across decades. But the most unsettling discovery was this: Kenneth had become the arbiter of his uncle's redemption. Ronald had engineered the situation with typical precision, forcing Kenneth to make the choice he himself had been too stubborn to make in life: forgiveness or continuation of grievance, grace or judgment. The cafe appeared on the horizon, rust and ruin hiding everything beneath. Kenneth pulled into the makeshift parking area and cut the engine. Brandon handed him the letter without comment. Kenneth added it to the growing collection of unopened envelopes they'd accumulated across 5 chambers. That night, after the boys slept, Kenneth sat with his back against the cafe wall and thought about Chamber 5's entrance. It had required 3 handprints: Kenneth, Brandon, Ryan. The system his father had built allowed no solo work, no individual achievement. Everything required cooperation, family, unity, trust. But Chamber 5 had also contained 2 envelopes: one for Kenneth and his sons, one for Gary, requiring Kenneth's judgment to deliver, which meant the next chamber might require 4 handprints instead of 3. Kenneth pulled out his phone and dialed Gary's number. It rang 4 times before his uncle's suspicious voice answered. "It's Kenneth. I need to talk to you about Dad." Silence on the other end stretched long enough that Kenneth thought the connection had dropped. Then, "I'm listening." "Can you meet me at the cafe tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock? Come alone." "Why?" Kenneth looked at the envelope bearing Gary's name, still sealed after 6 months and a lifetime. "Because I found something you need to see." Gary arrived at 9:45 early and wary, his truck kicking up dust that hung in the still morning air. Kenneth waited at the cafe entrance alone. He'd sent Brandon and Ryan to explore the coordinates his son had calculated, giving them something productive to do while Kenneth handled family business. His uncle climbed down from the truck slowly, age and caution making him careful. Up close in daylight, Gary looked more like Ronald than Kenneth had noticed during their first confrontation. Same broad shoulders, same way of holding his jaw slightly forward, as if perpetually skeptical. The family resemblance was undeniable. "You said you found something." Kenneth held out the envelope. Gary took it with hands that trembled slightly, his eyes never leaving Kenneth's face. When he saw Ronald's handwriting, saw his own name inscribed in his brother's precise capitals, his expression crumbled. "He wrote to me 6 months before he died." "Gave it to Margaret Campbell with instructions." Gary turned the envelope over, examining the seal, the yellowed paper, the evidence of decades passing while this message waited. "Why didn't she give it to me?" "Because Dad made me responsible for deciding if you'd earned it." Kenneth kept his voice neutral, factual. "I'm still deciding." His uncle's face hardened again, the vulnerability closing off behind practiced defenses. "You don't know anything about what happened between us?" "I know you lost $80,000 gambling. I know Dad paid your debts and cut you off. I know you haven't spoken in 40 years. Kenneth met Gary's eyes directly. "I also know you've been sober 18 years, that you counsel other addicts, that you asked Margaret about forgiveness. She told you that. She told me you'd changed. Whether you've changed enough, whether it's real or just desperation for the inheritance, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Gary looked at the envelope in his hands, then at the cafe behind Kenneth, then out at the desert, stretching endlessly away. When he spoke, his voice had lost its edge. I was 32 when I lost that money. Thought I could beat the house, thought I was smarter than odds and mathematics. Ronald bailed me out 3 times before the big loss. After he paid the 80,000, he told me I was dead to him, that I'd killed our partnership with my arrogance. Were you angry? Furious? For years, thought he was self-righteous, unforgiving, cruel. Gary's laugh was bitter. Took me until I was 50 to realize he was right. Took another 10 years to actually stop. And by then, he trailed off looking at the sealed letter. By then, it was too late to apologize. Kenneth made his decision. Chamber 5 needs 4 handprints to open the final vault. 3 of us can get to the door, but we can't finish without you. Gary's head snapped up. What are you saying? I'm saying Dad left part of the inheritance for you, conditional on you proving you've changed on me, trusting you enough to bring you in. Kenneth pulled out the second envelope from Chamber 5, the one marked for Gary. This explains your portion, but accessing it requires you to help us complete the final 2 chambers. As family. Together. His uncle stared at the envelope like it might explode. Why would you do this? I tried to steal everything from you. Because holding grudges compounds like interest. Because my father spent 40 years alone. Because of pride. Because my sons deserve to see that family can mean forgiveness instead of just obligation. Kenneth held out the envelope. Read it. Decide if you want to help us finish what Dad started. We have 7 days left. Gary took the envelope with shaking hands and broke the seal. His eyes moved across the page, reading words Ronald had written specifically for him, for this moment, for the possibility of redemption after decades of estrangement. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and looked at Kenneth with tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. He forgave me. He wanted you to earn it through me, through helping his grandsons inherit what he built. Kenneth turned toward the cafe. We need to go to Chamber 5, all 4 of us, tomorrow morning. Why not now? Because my sons need to meet you properly, need to understand who you are and what this means before we go down there together. Kenneth started walking, then paused. One more thing. When we finish this, when the inheritance is divided and the chambers are empty, the grudge ends completely. We're family from that point forward, or we're nothing. I need to know you can commit to that. Gary wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. I've spent 18 years trying to figure out how to apologize to a dead man. You're giving me the chance to apologize through action instead of words. His voice steadied, found its strength. I'm in, whatever it takes. They stood in the desert morning, uncle and nephew, separated by decades of family dissolution, and brought together by a dead man's elaborate test of character and judgment. Kenneth extended his hand. Gary shook it firmly, the grip of someone committing to something larger than himself. Somewhere in the cafe, beneath layers of rust and concrete and carefully constructed secrecy, Ronald's legacy waited for the family to finally reunite and claim it together. Kenneth called Brandon and Ryan back from their exploration. They'd found something in the coordinates Brandon had calculated, another entrance sealed and marked with symbols matching Chamber 6. But the discovery could wait. Family business came first. The boys approached Gary with visible wariness, maintaining distance while Kenneth made introductions properly this time. No accusations, no legal threats, just Kenneth's sons meeting their great uncle for the first time under circumstances that actually mattered. Gary crouched to their level despite his protesting knees. "I owe you both an apology. I've been trying to take something your grandfather built for you because I thought I deserved it more. I was wrong." Brandon's expression remained skeptical. Ryan just watched, processing. "Your grandfather and I built this cafe together when we were younger than your dad is now. We were partners, brothers, best friends." Gary's voice roughened. "I destroyed that through my own weakness. Spent 40 years paying for it. Your dad is giving me a chance to help you finish what your grandfather started, if you'll have me." The boys looked at Kenneth. He nodded once, "Your choice." Brandon spoke first. "Chamber 5 needs 4 handprints. You're the 4th. That mean you trust me? Means we need you. Trust comes after you prove yourself." Brandon's tone could have been carved from stone. He had Ronald's pragmatism, Kenneth realized, the same ability to separate necessity from emotion. Gary smiled despite the response. "Fair enough." They spent the rest of the day preparing for Chamber 5's completion. Kenneth laid out everything they'd learned across the previous chambers, the pattern of progressive difficulty, the way each space taught a specific lesson, the requirement for family cooperation. Gary listened with the intensity of someone memorizing information that might save his life. That night, the 4 of them sat around the cafe's least damaged table, eating sandwiches Kenneth had bought in town and talking about everything except the inheritance. Gary told stories about building the cafe, about Ronald as a young man before military service hardened him. The boys asked questions, their initial suspicion gradually softening into genuine curiosity. Kenneth watched the interaction and felt something shift in his chest. This was what his father had wanted, not just the money transferred successfully, but the family reunited. The grudge dissolved through action and choice, rather than death and obligation. Tomorrow, they'd complete Chamber 5 together. Then, 2 chambers remained, and 7 days to finish them. But tonight, for the first time since the eviction notice had destroyed Kenneth's previous life, he felt something almost like peace. Morning on day 26 arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of desert dawn that made distances deceive and mirages seem possible. Kenneth stood outside the cafe, watching the sun climb, calculating hours against chambers, probability against hope. 4 days remained, 2 chambers left. The mathematics suggested success, but mathematics didn't account for Murphy's Law or the ways complexity scaled with proximity to the finish line. Gary's truck pulled up as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. The old man climbed out, looking determined, carrying a backpack Kenneth hadn't seen before. When questioned, Gary unzipped it to reveal water bottles, first aid supplies, rope, and a satellite phone. "If we're going deep, we go prepared. Lessons I learned the hard way," Kenneth approved. The grudge might be dissolving, but trust still required verification through action. Brandon and Ryan emerged from the cafe, both moving with purpose. Ryan's color had returned fully, his energy rebuilding day by day. The boy no longer looked fragile, just young. Brandon carried the compiled notes from all 5 chambers patterns and symbols, cross-referenced with the methodical precision he'd inherited from Ronald's genes. They descended into Chamber 5 as a unit 4 handprints, activating the scanner simultaneously. The door that had refused to open for 3 now accepted 4 sliding back to reveal the continuation of what they'd started 3 weeks ago. The space beyond the initial room had remained sealed during Kenneth's first visit with the boys. Now, with Gary completing the family unit, a second door became visible at the chamber's far end. It bore no lock, no scanner, just a simple inscription carved into steel: "Brothers first, then fathers, then sons. In that order, truth emerges." Kenneth looked at Gary. His uncle's face had gone pale, reading the inscription. "He wants us to go down alone, just you and me." Brandon started to protest. Kenneth raised a hand, gentle but firm. "Your grandfather designed this. We follow his plan." The boys stayed in Chamber 5 while Kenneth and Gary descended alone through the newly revealed passage. The stairs went deeper than any previous chamber, dropping what felt like 40 feet into bedrock. Emergency lighting flickered on as they progressed, casting shadows that moved like living things against concrete walls. Chamber 6 waited at the bottom, a circular room, small and intimate, containing nothing but 2 chairs, facing each other across 6 feet of empty space. Between the chairs, a microphone stood on a simple stand. No treasure, no documents, just furniture and silence. Kenneth sat in the left chair. Gary took the right. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then a voice filled the room, Ronald's voice, pre-recorded and activated by their presence. "What did you learn from each other?" The question hung in the air, simple and impossible. Kenneth thought about the past 26 days, about Gary's evolution from adversary to ally, about his own journey from judgment to grace. Gary spoke first, his voice rough. "That pride destroys what love builds. That I spent 40 years being right instead of being family. That my brother gave me chances I threw away, and his son gave me the one chance I didn't deserve, but needed anyway." The microphone's light blinked green, accepting the answer. Kenneth searched for words adequate to the moment. "That forgiveness is harder than holding grudges. That it's also worth more. That my father loved his brother even when he couldn't show it. And that sometimes the cruelest gift is the one that forces you to grow." Green light again. Then the wall opposite the chairs slid back, revealing the real chamber 6 beyond. The vault inside was smaller than Kenneth expected, more archive than treasury. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled with years spanning 1979 to 2019. In the room's center, a glass case protected a single leather-bound ledger. Gary opened the ledger with reverent hands. Inside, Ronald's handwriting documented 40 years of financial decisions in exhaustive detail. Every land purchase, every sale, every reinvestment. The progression was mesmerizing. Small gains compounding into larger ones, patience rewarded across decades, risk calculated and managed with military precision. The final page contained the summary Kenneth had been seeking. Total assets, $237 million. The number was written clearly, underlined twice, with a breakdown showing sources. $165 million from real estate transactions. 43 parcels bought between 1979 and 2015, sold strategically, as Phoenix and Tucson sprawled outward into what had been worthless desert. Ronald had anticipated urban growth patterns 20 years before they materialized. 51 million from investments, stock portfolios managed conservatively, bonds held to maturity, dividend reinvestment plans that had turned thousands into millions through nothing but time and discipline. 21 million from European asset recovery. Kenneth recognized this from Chamber 2, the classified work Ronald had done retrieving stolen assets from collapsing Eastern European regimes, legal sanctioned and apparently quite lucrative for those patient enough to navigate the bureaucracy. The ledger's final notation specified Division 201 million for Kenneth and his sons, 36 million for Gary, conditional on completion of the full test. Gary's hands shook holding the page. He really forgave me. Kenneth's throat tightened. He wanted you to earn it through action, not words. You did. They found Chamber 7's location in a sealed envelope inside the 6th Chamber's filing cabinet drawer marked 2020. The instructions were precise coordinates, pointing 3.2 miles. Northwest walking distance, only no vehicles. A hand-drawn map showed landmarks: a split boulder, a dead saguaro, an outcrop shaped like a ship's prow. They surfaced to find the boys had packed supplies, water protein bars, the first aid kit Gary had brought. Brandon had already plotted the coordinates on his phone's GPS, calculating the route to minimize sun exposure during the hottest hours. We go now. We'll arrive around 2 p.m. Peak heat, but we can rest in shade before descending. Kenneth felt pride cut through his anxiety. His son thought like a tactician, planned like someone who understood that survival required more than courage. The military would love Brandon someday if he chose that path. Kenneth hoped he'd choose something easier. They walked in single file, Gary leading despite his age, because he knew this desert from decades of hunting and hiking. Kenneth followed, then Brandon, then Ryan, bringing up the rear. The heat built as the sun climbed, pressing down like a physical weight, turning breathing into work. Ryan stumbled after the first mile. Gary, 20 yards ahead, turned at the sound and walked back without comment. He knelt and offered his back. "Climb on." The boy hesitated. Kenneth nodded permission. Ryan climbed onto Gary's back, and the old man stood smoothly, despite the added weight, despite his 72 years, despite everything. Brandon watched this with an expression Kenneth couldn't quite read. Something was shifting in his son's assessment of their uncle, some barrier dissolving through witnessed action rather than promised change. They reached the coordinates at 1:58 p.m., the GPS confirming their location to within 10 feet. The outcrop rose 30 feet above the desert floor, its western face offering shade that felt like mercy after the brutal hike. Gary set Ryan down gently, then sank onto a flat rock with a grunt of relief. The entrance was hidden, brilliantly carved into the outcrop's base behind a natural fold in the stone that rendered it invisible unless approached from precisely the right angle. Someone had worked hard to ensure this chamber stayed secret, protected not by locks, but by the desert's vast indifference. The door bore an inscription larger than any before: "The Last Lesson." Kenneth ran his fingers over the words, feeling the depth of the carving, the permanence of the message. This was Ronald's final test, the culmination of everything he'd built and hidden and planned for. The biometric scanner required all 4 of them. They placed their hands together, and the door responded with a hydraulic hiss that spoke of maintenance and care. Someone had kept this equipment functional across years of disuse. Kenneth suspected Margaret had been more involved in Ronald's planning than she'd admitted. The descent exceeded any previous chamber. Stairs wound down through solid rock, following a natural fissure that had been widened and reinforced with concrete and steel. Emergency lighting activated in sections as they progressed, creating a path of illumination through otherwise absolute darkness. The chamber at the bottom took Kenneth's breath. Not from size, it was actually the smallest of the seven, but from intention. The circular room's walls were covered entirely in photographs, hundreds of them, creating a three-dimensional family history that spanned generations. Ronald, as a young man, perhaps 25, standing beside someone who could only be his father. The resemblance was undeniable. Both men wore work clothes. Both smiled at the camera with the confidence of people who built things that lasted. Ronald and a woman Kenneth didn't recognize, both young and laughing, clearly in love. Kenneth realized with a start this was his mother, dead before his earliest memories. He'd never seen her face outside of a single faded funeral photo. Ronald holding an infant Kenneth, the old man's expression uncertain but tender. Kenneth's wedding to Helen, both of them impossibly young. The twins as newborns, as toddlers, as gap-toothed children, grinning at every camera they encountered. Gary appeared in the earlier photos standing beside Ronald at the cafe's grand opening, the two brothers with arms around each other's shoulders. Then Gary disappeared from the timeline, absent from Kenneth's childhood, missing from every milestone after 1986, until the final photograph, added recently based on the paper's lack of yellowing. Gary, at maybe 70, standing in front of a small building with a sign reading Hayes Recovery Center. The photo had been placed deliberately beside the image of young Gary and Ronald at the cafe, creating a before and after narrative of failure and redemption. In the room's center, a glass case glowed with familiar blue light. Inside rested 4 watches, each nested in custom foam, each clearly valuable beyond mere monetary worth. The largest was an Omega Seamaster, worn but well-maintained, its back engraved with Ronald's military service number. Kenneth lifted it carefully, felt the weight of it, the reality of his father's wrist, having worn this for decades. The second was a Seiko women's style, delicate and elegant. The engraving read simply, Helen 1973. This had belonged to his wife before they'd met during her college years. How Ronald had obtained it, Kenneth couldn't imagine, but the care with which it had been preserved spoke volumes. 2 military watches remained a Timex with canvas strap standard issue, and a Hamilton from an earlier era. The Timex bore no engraving. The Hamilton was marked with 2 names, Ronald Hayes, Gary Hayes, 1978. Gary picked up the Hamilton with trembling hands. Dad gave us these when we opened the cafe. Told us to remember that time was the only thing we couldn't buy back once we'd wasted it. His voice broke. I forgot. For 40 years, I forgot. A card inside the case bore Ronald's final written message to them. Time is the only treasure you can't recover. Spend it with people who matter. Kenneth felt the words settle into his chest like stones, heavy and permanent. His father had spent 40 years alone, estranged from his brother, distant from his son, building an empire beneath the desert, while life happened in his absence. The irony was brutal. Ronald had learned the lesson too late to apply it to his own life, so he'd embedded it in his legacy for those who came after. A television monitor mounted on the wall flickered to life, automatically triggered by their presence, or perhaps simply by time elapsed since the case had opened. Ronald's face appeared on screen older than any previous recording, filmed perhaps 6 months before his fatal stroke. The timestamp confirmed August 2019, 5 months before death would end all of Ronald's careful planning. Ronald looked directly into the camera, his expression carrying weight beyond mere age. "Kenneth, if you're here with the boys, I'm proud. You didn't give up when most men would have. You chose family over ease, persistence over surrender. That's all I ever wanted to teach you." Kenneth's throat closed. He heard his sons breathing beside him, felt Gary shift his weight nearby. "Gary, if you're standing there, you found your way home. Welcome back, brother. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to say that while I lived. Pride is a poor substitute for family, and I learned that too late to do anything but apologize through instructions and locked doors." Gary made a sound like a wounded animal quickly stifled. "Brandon Ryan, take care of your father. He's stronger than he knows, but he'll need you. The world is hard for good men. Be good anyway. Be strong for each other. That's the real inheritance." Ronald paused, seeming to gather himself for his final message. "The money is a tool. Use it wisely. Build something that matters. Help people who need it. But remember, family is the real wealth. I forgot that for 40 years. Don't make the same mistake." The screen went dark. In the silence that followed, Kenneth heard his own heartbeat, heard Ryan's quiet crying, heard Brandon's measured breathing that suggested the boy was fighting for control. Gary moved first, dropping to his knees. "Kenneth, I'm sorry for everything, for the lawsuit, for using Ryan's illness, for 40 years of being too proud to fix what I broke." Kenneth pulled his uncle to his feet, the motion automatic, the forgiveness already complete. "We're family. Let's act like it." The embrace was awkward, unpracticed, two men who'd been strangers learning to be something more. But it was real. Kenneth felt Gary shaking, felt the old man's tears soaking through his shirt, and knew this moment was worth more than any amount of money Ronald had hidden beneath the desert. Behind the television, a final door revealed itself as the screen retracted into the wall. This vault was the real one, the last secret, the ultimate destination of Ronald's elaborate treasure hunt. The scanner required all four of them one final time. Kenneth, Gary, Brandon Ryan. Their hands together, their family unit, complete, their bond tested and proven across 29 days of challenges, conflicts, and choices. The vault opened to reveal a small room, almost claustrophobic, containing a single safe deposit box arrangement. Inside were the final pieces of Ronald's empire. Gold certificates worth $18 million, account information for offshore holdings in Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands deeds to 23 parcels of undeveloped land scattered across Arizona and Nevada, and a complete set of legal documents prepared by Patricia Williams explaining how to transfer everything legally and minimize tax exposure. Ronald had thought of everything, every detail, every contingency, every possible complication. He'd built a machine for transferring wealth across generations, and the machine had worked exactly as designed. Kenneth heard footsteps on the stairs behind them, Patricia appeared at the chamber entrance, slightly out of breath from the descent, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive. GPS tracker in the seventh chamber's door. Ronald wanted me here for this moment. I'll handle the legal transfer. He prepared everything years ago. All we need is your signature. She spread documents across the small room's floor, using the space like a makeshift office. Transfer of ownership forms, tax documents, trust establishment papers, everything required to convert Ronald's hidden empire into legitimate legal inheritance. Kenneth signed where indicated. The pen felt heavy, loaded with significance beyond its physical weight. Each signature transferred another piece of his father's life's work into his possession, his responsibility, his burden to manage wisely. Gary's documents came next. $36 million freed from 40 years of freezing in legal limbo, now available for the redemption Ronald had always wanted his brother to achieve. Patricia witnessed everything, her notary stamp making official what had been earned through sweat and perseverance and the hardest kind of family reconciliation. 7 chambers complete. 29 days elapsed. You met every condition. Patricia's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing genuine emotion beneath. Ronald would have been proud. I know I am. They emerged from Chamber 7 into late afternoon light that seemed too bright after the underground darkness. The hike back to the cafe passed in contemplative silence, each person processing what had just occurred, what they'd earned, what it meant for their futures. Day 30 arrived with bureaucratic finality. Patricia met them at the county recorder's office in Yuma, carrying files that represented Ronald's complete financial history and the proper documentation of Kenneth's inheritance. Gary's lawsuit was withdrawn formally, replaced with his acknowledgement of the legitimate will and his own conditional bequest. The clerk processed paperwork with mechanical efficiency, stamping forms, and entering data into systems that would make permanent what Ronald had spent 40 years building toward. Kenneth Walker now legally owned $201 million in various forms. Gary Hayes owned $36 million. Numbers on a screen, signatures on paper, the transformation of hidden treasure into recognized wealth. Gary stood in the parking lot afterward, holding his copy of the finalized documents, looking lost. Kenneth approached his sons, hanging back to give the adults space. I don't deserve this. Kenneth had heard this sentiment before, had wrestled with it himself. Dad thought you did. So do I. The question is what you do with it now. Gary looked at the papers, then at the desert stretching endlessly beyond Yuma's strip malls and fast food restaurants. The old debts from 1986, I paid most of them years ago, but some remain. I'll clear those first. Then, he paused, thinking. The Hayes Recovery Center runs on donations and volunteers. It could do more with actual funding. And the cafe, someone should restore it. Turn it into something that honors Ronald instead of letting it rot. A museum, memorial, and recovery center combined. Show people what addiction costs, what redemption looks like, what family means even when it breaks. Gary's voice gained strength as the vision solidified. Ronald Hayes Memorial and Recovery Center. Let people see the whole story, the success, the failure, the forgiveness. Kenneth extended his hand. Gary shook it firmly. Partners, family. Kenneth bought a house in Scottsdale 3 weeks later after Patricia had untangled the offshore accounts and liquidated enough assets to provide immediate liquidity. 4 bedrooms, a backyard with a pool, a neighborhood with good schools and low crime, the kind of stability he'd thought forever out of reach 30 days earlier. The cafe remained untouched during those initial weeks, preserved exactly as Ronald had left it, while Gary worked with architects and contractors to develop restoration plans. Kenneth visited weekly ostensibly to check on progress, but actually to sit in the quiet and think about his father. Ryan's health improved steadily, regular checkups confirming the infection had cleared completely. Dr. Bennett expressed satisfaction with his recovery, noting that the expensive antibiotics had worked exactly as designed. Kenneth paid the hospital bill in full, $118,000, without flinching. The money came from his portion of the inheritance, properly budgeted and allocated. Brandon and Ryan returned to school in September, transferring to a private academy that Kenneth could now afford without bankruptcy. The boys adapted quickly their shared experience in the desert, giving them confidence that translated into social success and academic performance. Teachers commented on their unusual maturity, their ability to work cooperatively, their resilience in facing challenges. Kenneth established the Walker Family Veterans Fund with an initial endowment of $5 million designed to provide housing assistance for homeless veterans and their families. He hired social workers, partnered with existing organizations focused on systemic solutions rather than temporary fixes. The irony of helping others after being helped himself wasn't lost on Kenneth. He'd been exactly one condemned cafe away from complete destitution. Now he could ensure others didn't fall as far. Margaret Campbell accepted his invitation to join the Memorial Museum's advisory board, bringing institutional memory and personal connection that no hired consultant could match. She attended meetings with her usual dry wit intact, keeping everyone honest about Ronald's flaws while celebrating his strengths. Timothy Moore, the contractor who'd tried to buy the cafe cheaply, sent a formal letter of apology along with a donation to the recovery center. Kenneth accepted both with grace, understanding that desperation made people do things they later regretted. He'd learned that lesson watching Gary's transformation. Forgiveness was cheaper than grudges and produced better returns. 4 months after completing Chamber 7, the Ronald Hayes Memorial and Recovery Center held its grand opening. The cafe had been restored beautifully, its curved metal exterior sandblasted, and repainted its windows, replaced its interior, transformed into a functioning museum and meeting space. The first floor displayed Ronald's story through photographs and artifacts, showing his military service, his business success, his elaborate planning, and his ultimate message about family and time. Chamber 1 had been opened to public viewing, its contents replaced with educational displays explaining the treasure hunt's mechanics and purpose. The remaining chambers stayed sealed, their locations known only to family. Gary ran the center with the dedication of someone making up for lost decades. He taught recovery courses, mentored struggling addicts, shared his own story without shame or hesitation. People responded to his authenticity, his refusal to pretend redemption was easy or permanent. The center's waiting list grew weekly. The opening day ceremony drew a small crowd. Patricia, Margaret, Dr. Bennett, other community members who'd played roles in the story without knowing its full scope. Kenneth stood with his sons on one side and Gary on the other, cutting a ribbon that symbolized transformation. Brandon's question came during the reception, quiet enough that only Kenneth heard. "Think Grandpa knew we'd make it?" Kenneth considered the question seriously, looking at the restored cafe at Gary, helping a nervous young man fill out intake forms, at Ryan, laughing with Margaret over some shared joke. He knew we'd try together. That's all he needed to know. That night, alone in his new house, after the boys had gone to bed, Kenneth opened the Omega Seamaster's box one final time. He'd been wearing the watch daily, feeling its weight on his wrist as a constant reminder of his father's legacy. Inside the box's lid, tucked into a pocket he hadn't noticed before, was a small folded paper. Kenneth unfolded it carefully, recognizing Ronald's handwriting immediately. The message was brief. P.S. Kenneth, when you read this, know I'm proud, not because you found the money, because you found each other again. Kenneth sat in his expensive house, surrounded by furniture he'd bought with inherited wealth, wearing his dead father's watch, and cried for the first time since Helen's funeral. Not from grief exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of understanding what Ronald had actually given him. Not money, not security, not even forgiveness, though that was part of it. Ronald had given him back his family, had forced him to choose cooperation over independence, grace over judgment, patience over expedience, had created conditions that required Kenneth to become the father and man he'd always wanted to be, but never quite achieved. The money was just the mechanism. The lesson was the inheritance. Kenneth folded the note carefully and returned it to the watch box. Tomorrow he'd show it to his sons and to Gary, share this final message with the family that had earned it. Tonight, he simply sat with the knowledge that his father had loved him enough to teach him the hardest lessons through the most elaborate means. Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed everything Kenneth had discovered, that his father's distance hadn't been coldness, but preparation, that Gary's bitterness had been pain seeking outlet, that his own sons had strength he'd never noticed until crisis forced it into the light? He'd discovered that wealth without family was just numbers, that time was indeed the only treasure that couldn't be recovered, that forgiveness was harder than holding grudges and worth infinitely more. He'd discovered that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what you receive, but who you become while earning it. Ryan appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Dad, you okay?" Kenneth smiled, wiped his face, and stood. "Yeah, buddy, just thinking about Grandpa." Was he a good person? The question deserved an honest answer. He was a complicated person who tried to be good, who made mistakes and learned from them, who loved his family even when he didn't know how to show it properly. Ryan patted across the room and leaned against Kenneth's side. "Like all of us, then." "Yeah, like all of us." Kenneth pulled his son close, feeling the boy's warmth, his solidity, his reality. Outside Scottsdale slept beneath desert stars. Somewhere out in that darkness, the cafe stood restored and purposeful chambers sealed beneath its floor. Ronald's legacy transformed from hidden treasure into living memorial. The desert had given them shelter when they had nothing. The chambers had given them wealth beyond measure. But the real treasure had been there all along, waiting for them to recognize it, the unbreakable bond of family, tested in adversity and proven in the hardest crucible of all. 3 weeks later, Kenneth received an email from Brandon's school. The boy had written an essay for English class titled, "What My Grandfather Taught Me About Wealth." The teacher had forwarded it to Kenneth with a note, "Thought you'd want to see this. It's exceptional." Kenneth opened the attachment and read his son's words. Brandon had written about the chambers, about the lessons, about watching Kenneth and Gary move from adversaries to family. The essay's final line hit Kenneth like a physical blow. We were always rich. We just needed a desert and some locked doors to see it. Kenneth closed his laptop and looked at the watch on his wrist, at the note folded carefully in his desk drawer, at the photograph of his sons smiling on his wall. He thought about Ronald's final message, about time being the only treasure that couldn't be recovered, about spending it with people who mattered. Then he picked up his phone and called his sons from their rooms, called Gary to invite him for dinner, called Margaret to include her in the family meal he was suddenly determined to share. Because that was the lesson. That was the inheritance. That was what survived when everything else turned to dust beneath the desert sun. Not the money, not the chambers, not even the elaborate puzzle Ronald had constructed. Just family, just time, just the decision to choose love over pride, forgiveness over grudges, together over alone. Kenneth had been homeless 29 days ago. Now he had everything that mattered. The desert had hidden Ronald's empire for 40 years, but it had revealed something more valuable in just 30 days, the truth that real wealth was measured in relationships, mended in lessons learned in families, reunited despite every reason to stay divided. And that truth, Kenneth realized, was worth infinitely more than $200 million could ever buy.